The thing that I think is so interesting about transformative experiences is that they act like a pill that rewires you. It makes you into a different kind of person. And what makes them interesting is in part this combination of newness and discovery and personal change that they bring. But another thing that makes them interesting is that they aren't like those other utterly mundane, important, but rather boring decisions that you make, because they break our ordinary models for making choices. Not only does it break the model, but those decisions are some of the most important decisions in our lives. My name is Laurie Paul. I publish as L.A. Paul, and I'm a professor of philosophy and cognitive science at Yale University.
Chapter 1: The Epistemic Wall.
I'm well known for my work on transformative experience and transformative decision making. So transformative experience is an experience that really has two important components. The first component is that it's epistemically transformative. And what I mean by this is that it teaches you something new. It's a new kind of experience for you. And essentially, it's the kind of experience that you have to have in order to know what it's like. And an easy example might be if you say you were colorblind and then suddenly put on a pair of chroma glasses and were then able to see color. And you might agree with me, I certainly think that until this person has actually put those glasses on and discovers what it's like to see red, there's a really important sense in which they just don't know what it's like to see red. They might know lots about it, but they don't know what it's like. The other part of a transformative experience involves the personal component. So an epistemically transformative experience, like seeing color for the first time, might be important and interesting. It might be quite profound, but it might not be as profound as all that. And what I mean is, it might not change who you are. A personally transformative experience is an experience that changes what you care about, maybe how you understand yourself, really changes some of your kinds of fundamental core preferences, some of the things that you care about most. The interesting cases are cases where the epistemic transformation and the personal transformation come into play together. In other words, there's an experience like having your first child, being diagnosed with a terminal illness, going to war, getting divorced, falling in love for the first time, that is both epistemically transformative. It's a new kind of experience that you've never had before. And at the same time, it's profound. It changes who you are. Through the discovery of what this experience is like, it basically reworks you in some very fundamental way, changing something that you care about most. What led me into this were a series of transformative experiences in my own life. I struggled with trying to decide what kind of career I wanted to explore. I left home when I was reasonably young and traveled around the world. And in particular, the really crucial change for me was when I had my first child. And that's because I'm sort of a person who likes to do a lot of research and get lots of anecdotal and scientific testimony when I'm making a big decision. And I thought very carefully about this, and I had many plans. And then I had a child, and I realized just how useless all of that preparation had been for really understanding what was about to happen to me and how my life was going to change. One of the first books I bought when I discovered I was pregnant is called What to Expect When You're Expecting. I felt that if I worked hard enough, if I thought hard enough, if I was careful enough, I could really know what was most likely to happen, how I should think it through, and what to expect in some sense. And so I would have a kind of control over my life as I was reconstructing myself. It's not that I didn't know that there were huge changes coming down the pike. I just somehow thought that I had more of an understanding of how this was going and more control over the whole process. And what I felt like I discovered at a personal level was that actually I was fooling myself. And I also thought that there was this kind of collective disillusion as well. I mean, the book was called What to Expect When You're Expecting, right? I got the idea of trying to explore as much as I could about what it was like to be a parent from this sort of collective assumption that that's the way that you make an informed choice. That's how you do things responsibly. That's what being thoughtful and careful about it involves. And I think that's just not right. It's just not true. I do think you should be thoughtful and careful. I do think you should try to, explore what other people can tell you before you make the decision. But thinking that that's going to arm you with what you need to know when you become a parent so that you can make your choices carefully, you can be the best possible parent so you know what you're getting yourself into is just wrong. In 2,500 years of philosophical exploration, somehow no philosopher had ever actually explored the nature of growing a baby and actually producing that baby and then falling in love with that baby, and how that could be both epistemically and personally transformative. Probably not too much of a surprise there, because most philosophers in the past have been people like Aristotle or Hume or others who weren't particularly likely to grow a baby inside of themselves and produce that baby. So maybe there was something about the diverse experience that I had that gave me that kind of insight. In any case, that was what happened. And once that happened and I reflected on how bizarre and interesting and kind of epistemically overwhelming it was, all of this ended up with me writing a paper called What You Can't Expect When You're Expecting about decision-making and having a child. The concept of an epistemic wall is something that I've been developing recently in my work. It's really a way of visualizing the importance of the epistemic shift that a transformative experience is going to bring. There's this sense in which you know your life is going to change dramatically in this radically new way, and yet you can't see that moment. So I think of it as not being able to see past an epistemic wall. Like I imagine standing in front of a high, featureless concrete wall, just a gray expanse. And you know by the next day you'll be on the other side of the wall, able to see the landscape in front of you. But right now, you can't see farther than 2 inches ahead. A way to explain the problem this presents for very standard, at least ordinary models of decision-making and rational choice can be explained by the way that we face this epistemic wall. Because if you face an epistemic wall, so you can't see beyond, then you can't, in an important imaginative way, see the outcomes or the nature of the outcomes that you're contemplating trying to bring about. So someone can tell you about them, but in a very important first personal way, if you can't be acquainted with those outcomes, especially as they apply to you, as opposed to how they will apply to other people, then there's a sense in which you can't assign value for yourself to the nature of this new experience. And this is important because not only do you want to be able to assign value to this new way of living your life, but you want to compare it to the possibility of not being a parent. In other words, to the value of how you live your life now. So you might know how you're living your life now and be able to assign that a value. But if you can't assign the possible new experience of value, you can't compare them. And so that means you don't have a defined preference. Mathematically speaking, you can't make the comparison in the way that you're supposed to for the model. But that's only the first problem. The second problem is, as I described a transformative experience, like becoming a parent, although there are many other ones, as I said, that experience changes you. It changes in how you care about something very deeply. A way to put this then is it changes some of your core or fundamental preferences. Think about it. The person who makes the choice, or the self that makes the choice, isn't the same as the person or the self who experiences the choice. And if your preferences are going to change as a result of that choice, then there's another way that the model's broken, because who you are then isn't the same person as who you will become. So the question is, do you choose in accordance with your preferences now, like you're supposed to with irrational calculus? Or do you do something where you think you're going to make your future self happy, even if right now that's not something you care about?
Chapter 2, The Vampire Thought Experiment.
Okay, so a way that I like to sort of explain the concept of transformative experience and how it can create interesting problems for decision-making is to think about a fictional example. So, imagine yourself going on holiday, touring castles in medieval Europe, and you go down into the dungeon, and as you go around a corner, Dracula suddenly appears. And he says to you, I think I'd like to make you one of my own. I'm going to give you a one-time only chance to become immortal, to become a member of the undead. You'll have amazing strength. You'll look fabulous in black. Sorry. This is a fantastic opportunity, and you should take it. And so you're a little surprised by this opportunity, and you think about it, and you say, well, look, I just need a little bit of time to think about it. Can I have until tomorrow? And he says, well, you can have until midnight. Go back to your Airbnb, think about it. If you want to become one of mine, leave your window open. If you don't, keep your window closed, and then leave this place and never come back. Okay. So you've got until midnight. You rush back to your Airbnb. You start pacing the floor and start thinking about the possibilities, because it sounds pretty fantastic. But then as you think about it a little bit more, you remember that vampires are soulless monsters under some constructions. They have to sleep in coffins and they have to drink blood. So this is less appealing. On the other hand, they are practically immortal as long as you stay away from villagers with stakes and, people like that. So you keep thinking about it. You call your friends, you talk to your mom, and then you find out that all of your friends and your mom have already become vampires. And you ask them, why didn't you tell me about this? And then, by the way, what should I do? And to a person, they say, look, you should absolutely become a vampire. We think it's fantastic. Each vampire tells you how fabulous being a vampire is for them, even if they were afraid before, even if they were unsure about, having Dracula clamp his fangs over their neck. But now they're happy. And in fact, they say, life has meaning and a sense of purpose that it never had when they were human. But then they also tell you, because you quiver a little bit, obviously, when you think about fangs clamping on your neck, that not to worry, even though it might seem unknown and frightening and maybe isn't really something that you're sure you would want to do, that once you do it, you'll be happy. But you can't possibly understand the meaning of what it's like to be a vampire until you actually become one. So you just have to trust them. So there's your information. What do? How do you think about that choice? And really what I think is you can't possibly be expected to employ the rational calculus to make this choice. Why can't you? Well, you know what it's like to be human. But by hypothesis, you can't possibly understand the meaningfulness and importance of what it's like to be a vampire unless you actually become one. So sure, vampires are really happy with being a vampire. They think it's the most fabulous thing ever, right? But you, as a human being, might not have that preference. You might not care about the things that vampires care about. So the fact that you can be transformed into a species that cares about drinking blood and cares more, let's say, about vampire concerns than human concerns, shouldn't really move you as a human making that choice. And that means that the testimony that you're hearing sounds like it's coming more like from someone who's got a kind of Stockholm syndrome than is actually unbiased in the relevant way. And I think this applies really well to parenting, especially if somebody isn't sure whether they want to become a parent. Because as we all know, when you become a parent, all of a sudden you have a lot less money, you get a lot less sleep, you have a lot less time, you have a lot more stress. These don't ordinarily seem like things that contribute to people's well-being. However, people who become parents are, not universally, but are often very, very happy with their choice. They say things like, well, life has a certain kind of meaning that it never had. Even if I'm run ragged, I experience a kind of joy that I never experienced. But if you aren't sure before you become a parent whether this is even a kind of life that you want to live, how are you possibly going to make a decision about that, given that you can't possibly know what it's like to become a parent before you become one?
Chapter 3: Testimony and Identity.
So one of the reasons why I think that this kind of decision didn't get enough attention in the past is because there is a sense in which you can just use testimony and data to solve the problem. If the thought is, well, I don't know if I want to become a parent, so the answer is to go and look up all of the data and testimony that's been collected in psychology and in economics and other fields. Ask your friends and relatives. They all tell you, let's say, it's usually not universal, but let's just say the vast majority of parents tell you that they're happy. Then even if you yourself don't know what you want, you could just substitute all of that information to make the choice officially, rationally. And what you're doing is you're saying, well, I'm enough like those other people. And even if I can't know what it's like, I know that I'll say the same sorts of things that they say. Oh, I'm so happy that I did it. Oh, I feel like my life is meaningful now in a way that it wasn't before. But what we really want to be able to do is to understand what we're doing when we do it. In other words, if I want to choose to become a parent, or I want to get divorced, or I want to go to war, or take your favorite transformative experience and decision that accompanies it, I want to understand what it means for me. I want to understand how I'm making the choice, why I'm making the choice, and to understand how I'm changing the way my life is now for a new way of living. And I don't get any of that information from the testimony. In a sense, all I get are the numbers. There are a lot of ways in which these decisions are really about identity. Just because somebody comes from my economic class, my geographical region, has my level of education, has some of my other very basic preferences, lives their life in some ways that are similar to mine. I don't think a lot of times that's enough to make that identity assumption. There might be special things about me. Maybe I'm quite impatient and so might be ill-suited to having a child. Maybe I'm especially committed to my career, and so I would feel the loss of the time and the energy that I would suffer basically from devoting that time to my child instead of to my career. So I might not be relevantly similar to other people in all the important respects. And there's no way to know that. That's the problem is because I can't know what it's going to be like to have this new experience. I can't kind of perform my own intuitive adjustment with respect to the data. I have to just take it all on spec. So that's one identity issue. The other identity issue goes back to this problem about preference replacement. There's a way of thinking of someone's identity, not just strictly in terms of being the same person, but a little bit more loosely in terms of being the same kind of person. So I would say when you become a parent, or if you go to war, or if you become a vampire, or even if you get divorced, that in many ways, even though you're strictly speaking the same person before and after that experience, you're not always the same kind of person. And so changing these sorts of essential things, these identity-defining aspects, they involve quite radical choices. And again, we go back to why transformative experiences and transformative decisions are so important, right? It's a special class of decisions that are identity-defining decisions. You use them to define, in some sense, the kind of person that you are, or maybe even if you want to change yourself, to make yourself into a new kind of person. What I don't think is that people should decide to become a parent because they think they know what they're getting into. I think instead, it's perfectly legitimate to try something new because you want to be open to a new kind of experience. The testimony that's out there about people who become parents, I think does give you a certain kind of guide. You do know that however it is you're going to change, at least you will testify, most likely, to being happy to have that you've changed your life that way. There are other things, though, to do, too. Some people feel like, no, what I want to do is travel the world and experience new cultures. I want to experience that side of humanity. I think that's also potentially transformative, and that's, also an excellent reason to take the transformative choice. But the reason why I'm emphasizing this is because there's a real difference, I think, between making a choice to do something where you recognize there's a lot of unknowns involved and making a choice where you think you know what's going to happen. Because in the first context, you have responsibility, but the way that you might praise or blame someone for ending up in a situation that they were either happy with or unhappy with, I think is really different. Because if there are dimensions of what they're doing that they couldn't possibly have known about before they did them, then you have to forgive them for making that mistake, right? Or you might not want to praise them for making that choice, even if some of the consequences were excellent. I think of it as taking a stance of epistemic humility, recognizing what you can't know, as opposed to thinking that you can kind of know everything that's going to happen. And my hope is that when thinking about transformative decision-making and transformative experiences, that's what people focus on, not whether or not they can make the decision. Because of course they can make the decision, they just can't make it the way that they want to make it.
Chapter 4, Our Future Selves.
So when we're thinking about future selves, I think it's really important to think about how a future self, in the way that I'm thinking about it after transformation, isn't just a changed or adapted self. It's a new self. You're a new kind of person in a certain way. As I said, you still have your birth certificate, you still have your driver's license. In some sense, you're the same person. You've persisted through the change. And yet, I think something indefinable, or maybe even somewhat definable, has changed. And I think about this as involving a very kind of deep epistemic shift. I've done some computational research with some of my colleagues at Yale on how to think about this in terms of conceptual frameworks. So let me start with the example that we explored, just to get a sense of how this shift happens. We explored little agents, these are artificial intelligence agents, that learned to navigate a two-dimensional space. So they lived in what you can describe as Flatland. And this is explicitly a reference to a famous book called Flatland by Edwin Abbott, which was about these shapes that lived in a two-dimensional space. The shapes living in a two-dimensional space can only discover the shapes of other shapes by moving around them in a line. And so they can't go around like up or down. So they don't have a concept of volume. The way the story goes is one of the two-dimensional shapes is suddenly thrust into a three-dimensional reality and discovers like what it's like to see a cube or a sphere or other kinds of shapes in an entirely new way. So what we did was model this using little agents that we built to discover what happens when the agent moves from a two-dimensional space to a three-dimensional space and has an epistemic transformation. And what we found was that the concept of three-dimensional space erases the concept of two-dimensional space. So the three-dimensional concept basically replaces the two-dimensional concept. In the Flatland story, the little shape goes back to its two-dimensional world and it can't describe three-dimensional reality to any of the other shapes. So it gets ostracized and mistreated because none of the other shapes can understand it. Historically, this story became very famous when Einstein introduced his theory of relativity, because Einstein's theory can be thought of as introducing time as the fourth dimension. So the thought was Flatland explains how difficult it can be to grasp the possibility of having an additional dimension in reality. The way that I apply this to transformative experience is to think about the concept of conceptual revolution more generally. So here's a real historical example. In antiquity, we used to think that the sun revolved around the earth. Right? And this seems to make sense. It stands to reason, right? You see the sun rise in the east, you watch it travel across the sky, and it sinks in the west. So obviously, the sun is rotating around the earth, unless you're a flatlander. But let's just assume that we're gonna accept that the earth is round. What Copernicus realized was, in fact, that in some sense the numbers lined up better if the earth revolves around the sun. This doesn't change anything about the way that we experience the sun, down here on the surface of the earth. What he realized is that we needed to replace our conceptual framework where the sun was rotating around the earth with a new conceptual framework where the earth rotated around the sun. This wasn't just a scientific revolution. It changed all kinds of deep cultural ideas. So it changed certain kinds of religious stories. It changed very broadly what we thought the role of human civilization was, like in the nature of the universe, right? Because all of a sudden, instead of the earth being the center of everything, it turns out that the sun was the center of the universe. I think of personal transformation as being like this, right? In other words, replacing one way of thinking about the world, one conceptual framework, with a different conceptual framework. It's like discovering a third dimension, or discovering that one way you thought about the world, like thinking that the sun is rotating around the earth, with a completely different way of thinking about the world where the earth rotates around the sun. It's a mini scientific revolution, like a revolution of one. So I think of a person as constructed from a series of selves over time. And the self that I am now, that realizes the person that I am, is comprised really of a collection of dispositions, of ways of thinking, of ways of making sense of the world. And what transformation does is sort of destabilize this collection. If you think of yourself as partly defined by, again, what you care about, how you judge things, how you make sense of the world, and how you make choices, and how you show who you are to other people by the choices that you make, then reconfiguring that is a way of reconfiguring your identity. And that's what I mean by like replacing the self that you are with a new self, even if you're the same person.
Chapter 5: Collective Transformation and AI.
So I think it's pretty clear that there is the possibility of collective transformation. I think that wars, revolutions, financial upheaval, technological change, these all involve both transformations at the level of the individual, but also transformations at the level of society. And one of the things I think that's important with respect to these kinds of changes is that we're careful about some of the risks that we're undertaking. Like, it's one thing if I personally am happy to be a risk taker, and so I decide I'm going to have a baby, or I'm going to move to the other side of the world, or whatever it is I want to do. But when lots of people are involved, when a society is involved, or especially when there are lots of people who don't get to make those choices, I think it's especially important then to adjust our risk calculation and to think about the collective transformation as something different from what's happening at the level of the individual. Well, one of the things that's really special about artificial intelligence is that we're exploring new ways to think. And so we're doing much more than just discovering a new tool. We're exploring ways to change how we ourselves think. Because if you think about how, in particular now, how chatbots are presented to us, they're supposed to be partners in thinking through problems, partners in exploring ideas, partners in kind of accomplishing various kinds of projects. So it's not like I'm going to use this tool and just do something like a typewriter or some fancy new physical machine. The idea is to change even how we think about problems and how we might solve them. And the objectives of AI researchers don't stop here in businesses, right? I mean, the objective in some contexts is to actually meld our minds to some of this technology. So we're not even just talking about remaining human in a straightforward sense. We're actually talking about the possibility of shifting the kinds of entities that we are and changing our brains in particular ways, especially if we can ultimately connect our brains to some of the artificial minds that we're constructing. And one of the complications is that the machines are changing. They're changing fast, but they're still changing in steps. And so it's a somewhat drawn out transformation that we as individuals are undergoing, as well as we as a society are undergoing. And I definitely have worries that it's not being driven for the right reasons. It's much more about profit, I think, and the excitement of discovering the new than thinking about whether or not humanity overall is going to benefit from this. And I think importantly, it's incredibly hard to understand how things are going to change. It doesn't mean I'm anti-technology, far from it. I think every kind of scientific revolution has involved this kind of large-scale change. But there's something really distinctive about this one because it's about, as I said, how we think. And so we might really be fundamentally changing how we relate to the world and how we even understand ourselves as a result of the process. You can see this in a small way when people talk about having relationships with AIs. Right? Because if you think about how being in love with another person can change who you are, well, then having a relationship with an AI mind can change you easily as much, and maybe even more, because these companions tend to be incredibly powerful in the way that they relate to people, or at least how people think they're relating to them. There's an open question there. The best thing we can do is have this stance of humility. I think there's a lot of really interesting and open promise that AI can bring. I also think there's a whole lot that we don't know. So I think although there's great potential, there's also great risk. And the risk comes from the unknowns. It's not that we're uncertain about what's going to happen. There's just a true kind of unknowability here. And when there's unknowability, we need to proceed with that in mind, right? We shouldn't be naive. There has to be a kind of humility here. If it concerns yourself alone, I personally am a fan of a bit of risk-taking and a bit of bravery because I think that transformation can bring what I describe as revelation. So discovering a new kind of experience, discovering a new way to live in the world, understanding the world in a new way, I think can have a kind of benefit. It can be very exciting. And this is what I mean by revelation. So I attach a lot of value to discovering new kinds of experiences and also even to the pain and the suffering that comes with having to remake yourself. But if it's not just me, if other people are affected or if what I do would cause transformations in other people, I do think that the risk calculus has to change. I think then it's not so obvious that newness and openness should be the goal. It's just a much more complicated calculation. So there's a very kind of self-involved way of thinking about transformation where depending on your risk appetite, you might be discover this new way of living as long as the testimony suggests that the distribution of the effects are on the positive side rather than the negative side. But when other people are involved, when other people depend on you, then a precautionary principle is probably more in order. As an analytic philosopher, we tend to try to frame things in logical ways. We want to explore premises and draw conclusions. We want to reason and think very carefully. That's exactly how I want to think about things. That's exactly the way I want to proceed. But I think it's incredibly important to find a way to do this that takes account of what it's like to be a person, what it's like to be human, and what it's like to experience the world from the metaphysical point of view, from the epistemological point of view, not just from the ethical point of view, not just from an historical point of view. Transformation has been a part of human civilization since civilization began, but I think it's still really poorly understood, and I'm amazed that there isn't more explicit discussion and quantification in science. There are stories and testimonies, but on the scientific side, which is the side that I come from, why there hasn't been more attention paid to human experience and the struggles that we undergo, especially the struggles that we undergo when we become parents or face death or face the kind of destruction that we find like in war and suffering. And I'm not saying it's an easy problem. It's an incredibly hard problem to try to quantify this in some sense, but I also think it's incredibly important because these are the most meaningful transitions that we go through.